Hi, this is Heidi Burgess with the fourth in the Business as Usual series. This one is looking at power and a more enlightened way to think about and use power, which we and some of our colleagues, namely Paul Wehr, I'll talk about him later, refer to as the power strategy mix. Let's start out by defining power. The article on Beyond Intractability that focuses on power was written by Maura Dugan, and she defined power as the ability to bring about change. I go a little bit further, though, because you want to be able to bring about change in the direction and in the manner in which you intended. So I would say that power is the ability to get what you want or to do what you want, to bring about change towards the good as you define good. Dugan also distinguishes between sources of power and forms of power or power strategies. Sources of power is where you get your power. Power strategies is what you do with it. She turns to Gene Sharp, the leading theorist of nonviolence theory, to list 5 primary sources of power. Those are authority, human, or what I would call people power, power in numbers, skills and knowledge, material resources, and a host of what Sharp and Dugan refer to as intangible factors: esprit de corps, faith, obedience, culture, that kind of thing. Kenneth Boulding referred to 3 faces of power. He wrote a whole book with that title. Or another phrase for the same thing is power strategies. And these he metaphorically referred to as the stick, the carrot, and the hug. The stick referring to coercive or threat power, the carrot referring to trade or negotiation or what he called exchange power, and the hug referring to what he called love, but then he said if love seems too strong a word, substitute the word respect. We also substitute the word integrative power or collaborative power. Let's talk about each one of these a little bit more. The basic form of coercive power is you better do what I say or else something bad will happen to you. It's a threat, and if your threat is not complied with, generally in order to make the coercive power stick, you need to follow through with a negative sanction. It might be a physical negative sanction, such as the pictures you see here. It might be embarrassing somebody. It might be withholding something that they need, like their freedom or resources that they need. But it's doing so in a threatening, coercive, punitive way. Exchange power is exchanging rewards with someone who does what you want. So if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. That's basic negotiation. That's what we do all the time when we work to earn money. It's what we do when we buy things. We trade money for stuff that we want. Whenever we give something to get something, it gives us power. And it gives the other side power because we get what we want. But we did it through mutual beneficial exchange. Integrative power, or respect, love, or the hug, Boulding said was the most fundamental form of power because he points out the other two do not work without it, but it can work without the other two. I have a picture of Martin Luther King here because this is the power that King used extensively. He did use coercion, threatening massive public protests if the government didn't agree to his demands. At times he negotiated. I was very surprised to find out that he even offered to negotiate where the line would be drawn in the bus after Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back and before the Montgomery bus boycott. Taylor Branch's History of that era explained that King actually offered to negotiate redrawing the line, and it was the White Citizens Council which refused to negotiate, and it ultimately led to the desegregation entirely of the buses and the schools and all the other aspects of our culture. Integrative power is also extremely important because you can consider it the glue that holds our social groups together. It holds couples together, families, religious groups, work groups, nation states. If we didn't have integrated power, we would just disintegrate into individuals fighting each other. A lot of different people and theorists have come up with related descriptions. Here you see Boulding's list at the left. Closely parallels feminist theory that talks about power over as opposed to power with. Peter Coleman, who we've talked about and will talk about more in other videos, talks about the realist paradigm and the human relations paradigm, which are pretty much equivalent to the stick and the hug. And I teach about conflict styles, and they relate here too. The competitive conflict style tends to use the stick, the compromise conflict style uses the carrot, and the cooperative conflict style uses the hug, primarily anyway. A colleague of Kenneth Boulding's and ours, Paul Wehr, went one step beyond Kenneth's three faces of power to develop a notion that he called the power strategy mix. And the basic idea is that most often the different forms of power are usually used together. They're not used in isolation. When I teach this, I talk about it being thought of as a recipe. Sometimes you need a lot of one ingredient, sometimes you need more of another, and sometimes you need a moderate amount of each. This leads to a rather complicated graph. Across the top, below the black arrow which says types of people, you can see that we have listed 4 different categories of people. People who are easily convinced to do what you want, we refer to as persuadables. People who might do what you want but need considerable pushing are what we call reluctant persuadables. People who don't really care about the principle but they're willing to trade are traders. And people who have their heels dug in the sand and by gosh they're not going to compromise, I talked about them before, we call incorrigibles. Now, a key to determining how to be most effective in conflict is to try to figure out if you're dealing with a persuadable, a reluctant persuadable, a traitor, or an incorrigible, and design your power strategy mix accordingly. Now, here at the bottom you can see that coercive power is illustrated with red. Exchange power is illustrated with green, and I didn't get the greens matched up, I apologize. And collaborative power is illustrated with white. So if you decide that you're working with somebody who's likely a persuadable, why use a lot of coercive power? All it's going to do is make them mad. You don't even necessarily need to exchange much, because you might be able to convince them to do what you want without even giving them much in exchange. You should use primarily integrative power, where people do something for you because they want to, because they love you, because they respect you, because they think it's the right thing to do. If you're dealing with a traitor, you should use mostly exchange. You may use some persuasion to try to explain why the exchange that you're proposing makes sense or it's good for everybody. And you might need to use a little bit of coercion to get them to listen to you in the first place, but mostly you use exchange. If you have somebody or a group who are really stuck in the sand, you don't have a whole lot of choice. You can have to rely on coercive power to get their attention, to convince them that they're really better off negotiating, or that they're better off doing what you want to do for idealistic reasons. That's why you see a little bit of white, you see a little bit of green. I actually think I should have made the green portion of the farthest right tower bigger than the white, but they're both very small as opposed to the coercive power. And you'll note that that fourth tower to the right is also skinnier than the others. That's not an accident, that's on purpose, because we think that people tend to think that they're dealing with incorrigibles, when very often they're not. Most people actually fall into the other three categories. So if you fall back onto I'll fight you for it rules, like Guy talked about in the last video, you're going to be wasting coercion, you're going to be risking backlash, something I'm going to talk about in a coming video, unnecessarily. You should use a different power strategy mix. And then that second to the left tower I didn't talk about. Those are the people who are reluctant persuadables. They're going to take some coercion maybe. They're going to take some exchange to get them to pay attention to you. And then once you get their attention, they will be persuadable. So the key here is you don't use the same power strategy with everybody. And you don't fall back on I'll fight you for it rules, except in exceptional circumstances, with those few people who are far over on the right. Much better to have a softer power strategy mix.